The concept of Allah predates Islam, emerging within the polytheistic traditions of pre-Islamic Arabia. In the bustling trade city of Mecca, the Kaaba stood as a central site of worship, housing numerous idols revered by the various tribes of the region. Among these deities was Allah, regarded by many as the high god, a figure of authority above the other gods but not the sole object of devotion. This understanding of Allah as part of a pantheon challenges the Quran's later assertion that Allah is the eternal singular deity who has always demanded monotheistic worship. The transformation of Allah from a high god among many to the singular focus of worship under Islam did not occur in a vacuum. Historical evidence suggests that this shift was part of a broader trend observed in other ancient cultures. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, the god Marduk rose to prominence within a pantheon, becoming the chief deity of Babylon. Similarly, the Hebrew tradition evolved from polytheistic roots, with Yahweh eventually becoming the singular God of the Israelites. Muhammad's emphasis on Allah as the one true God mirrored this pattern, aligning with his goal of unifying the fragmented tribes of Arabia under a single religious and political identity. This raises significant questions. If Allah is truly the eternal, unchanging creator of the universe, why does his early portrayal resemble the developmental arc of other deities in human history? Why does the Quran present Allah as though he only began interacting with humanity in a meaningful way through Muhammad? These questions challenge the Quran's claim that Islam represents the original and purest form of monotheism, rather than a reinterpretation of existing ideas tailored to the cultural and political needs of 7th century Arabia. But there is an absence of evidence for the historical evidence for Allah as a monotheistic god before Islam. Archaeological findings, such as inscriptions and artifacts from the pre-Islamic period, depict a society deeply entrenched in polytheism, with Allah appearing as one among many. Furthermore, the Quran itself acknowledges the polytheistic practices of the time, frequently condemning idol worship and calling for a return to the worship of Allah alone. This implies that the concept of monotheism as introduced by Muhammad was a radical departure from the existing religious landscape. To fully appreciate the significance of this shift, we must examine the socio-political context in which Muhammad's revelations occurred. Mecca, as a hub of trade and culture, was rife with tribal rivalries and competing interests. By advocating for the worship of a single deity, Muhammad offered a unifying framework that transcended tribal divisions. The idea of Allah as the one true God served not only as a spiritual message, but also as a practical strategy for consolidating power and creating cohesion among the disparate tribes of Arabia. Yet, this consolidation came with challenges. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes the resistance Muhammad faced from his contemporaries, many of whom were deeply invested in the traditional polytheistic practices that centered around the Kaaba. These practices were not merely religious, but also economic, as pilgrims from across the region visited Mecca to honor their gods, contributing to the city's prosperity. By calling for the rejection of idols and the exclusive worship of Allah, Muhammad threatened the existing social and economic order, provoking hostility from the Meccan elites. In this context, it becomes clear that the elevation of Allah as the sole deity was not just a theological assertion but also a revolutionary act. Muhammad's message disrupted the status quo, challenging deeply ingrained traditions and reshaping the religious landscape of Arabia. However, this raises a crucial question for those examining Islam from a skeptical perspective. Was this transformation driven by divine revelation, or was it a calculated move to address the political and social challenges of the time? The Quran presents itself as the ultimate and final revelation of divine truth, correcting the errors of earlier scriptures and guiding humanity on the straight path. However, when we scrutinize its content, we find it deeply intertwined with Jewish, Christian, and even pagan traditions that predate it. This raises an essential question. Is the Quran truly a divinely revealed, unique text, or is it a product of its historical and cultural environment, borrowing from existing sources to construct its narrative? Many of the Quran's stories mirror those found in the Bible and other religious texts. The story of Adam and Eve, for instance, is strikingly similar to the Genesis account. In both, humanity's first couple is placed in a paradise only to disobey God and be expelled. Yet the Quran introduces slight variations, such as Adam being forgiven for his sin, in contrast to the Christian concept of original sin. While defenders of the Quran argue that these differences reflect its role in correcting earlier scriptures, skeptics see them as evidence of adaptation rather than originality. Another example is the flood narrative. In the Quran, as in the Bible, Noah is a prophet who builds an ark to save the faithful from a devastating flood. The details, however, align not only with the biblical account, but also with the much older epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text that predates both. In Gilgamesh, a figure named Utnapishtim builds a boat to survive a flood sent by the gods. The similarities across these three traditions suggest a shared origin, raising doubts about the Quran's claim to unique divine authorship. The Quran's portrayal of Jesus also warrants examination. Unlike the Christian Gospels, the Quran denies Jesus' divinity and rejects the concept of the Trinity, presenting him instead as a prophet and servant of Allah. Yet it retains key elements of his story, such as the virgin birth and his miraculous abilities. Interestingly, some of these details, like Jesus creating birds from clay, appear in apocryphal Christian writings rather than the canonical Gospels. This suggests that the Quran may have drawn not directly from the Bible, but from oral traditions and less widely accepted texts circulating in the region. The parallels between the Quran and earlier Jewish traditions are equally compelling. Many Quranic laws, such as dietary restrictions and rituals, bear a resemblance to those found in the Torah. Stories like the parting of the Red Sea and Moses receiving the commandments are also recounted, often with slight modifications. While Muslims believe these changes reflect the Quran's role in restoring the truth, skeptics argue that they demonstrate its reliance on pre-existing narratives. One might ask why these similarities matter. After all, religious texts often share themes and stories, reflecting the cultural and historical context in which they arose. The issue lies in the Quran's claim to be a revelation directly from Allah, untainted by human influence. If the Quran draws from earlier traditions, how can it claim to be entirely divine in origin? Shouldn't a text from an omniscient deity transcend the knowledge and beliefs of its time? Furthermore, the Quran's integration of earlier traditions is not limited to its stories. Its cosmology, for example, reflects the understanding of the natural world in 7th century Arabia. Verses describing the earth as spread out like a carpet or the sky as a canopy mirror the flat earth cosmologies common in ancient cultures. While these descriptions might have been seen as metaphorical or poetic, they are difficult to reconcile with the Quran's claim to scientific precision and divine authorship. This brings us to the concept of scientific miracles in the Quran, a popular apologetic argument among modern Muslims. Advocates claim that the Quran contains advanced knowledge of science, from embryology to astronomy, proving its divine origin. One often cited example is the Quran's description of fetal development, which mentions the formation of a clinging clot, alaqah. While this might seem impressive at first glance, it closely parallels the ideas of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, such as Galen, whose works were known in the Middle East long before the Quran. This reliance on earlier knowledge becomes even more problematic when we consider the Quran's contradictions with modern science. For instance, it describes the sun setting in a muddy spring, Surah 18:86, a claim inconsistent with our understanding of astronomy. Apologists argue that this verse is metaphorical or reflects the perspective of a human observer, but such interpretations raise further questions. If the Quran is meant to be a clear and perfect guide, why does it require so much explanation and reinterpretation? The Quran's defenders might argue that its integration of earlier traditions shows continuity in divine revelation, but this perspective assumes that those earlier texts were also divinely inspired. A more plausible explanation is that the Quran reflects the cultural and religious milieu of Muhammad's time. Its stories, laws, and cosmology are products of an era when oral traditions, trade routes, and cultural exchanges shaped the understanding of the world. One of the Quran's boldest claims is its challenge to humanity, to produce a text like it if they doubt its divine origin. This concept, known as the Ijaz al-Quran, inimitability of the Quran, is presented as proof of its divine authorship. Surah 2:23 states, "And if you are in doubt about what we have sent down upon our servant, Muhammad, then produce a surah the like thereof, and call upon your witnesses other than Allah, if you should be truthful." But what does this challenge really entail? And does it hold up to scrutiny? To evaluate the Quran's claim of inimitability, we must first consider what makes a text inimitable. Proponents argue that the Quran's linguistic beauty, rhetorical style, and structure are unmatched. Yet these qualities are inherently subjective. What one person finds beautiful or profound, another may find unremarkable. Furthermore, the Arabic language, like any other, is filled with poetic traditions and literary styles. Pre-Islamic Arabian poetry, such as the famous Mu'allaqat, was celebrated for its elegance and complexity. Muhammad himself encountered resistance from poets who accused him of being merely another talented orator rather than a prophet. If the Quran's inimitability rests solely on its literary merits, how can this be a universal standard for divinity? The challenge presupposes a familiarity with classical Arabic and an appreciation for its stylistic nuances, criteria that exclude the vast majority of humanity. Would an omnipotent deity rely on such a limited and culturally specific standard to prove its existence? Beyond literary style, the Quran's content also raises questions. Its narratives are often fragmented and repetitive, with stories like those of Moses, Noah, and Abraham appearing multiple times, sometimes with minor variations. While believers may see these repetitions as reinforcing key messages, skeptics argue that they reflect a lack of originality, or even a reliance on oral traditions that were retold and adapted over time. Another issue lies in the Quran's internal contradictions. For example, Surah 4:82 claims, "Do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found within it much contradiction." Yet numerous inconsistencies have been identified, both theological and historical. One example is the Quran's differing accounts of Pharaoh's fate during the Exodus. Surah 10:92 states that Allah saved Pharaoh's body as a sign for future generations, while other verses imply his destruction. Apologists often reconcile these contradictions with creative interpretations, but this raises an important question. Should a divinely revealed text require such extensive explanation to maintain coherence? These issues become even more significant when we examine the Quran's compilation process. According to Islamic tradition, the Quran was revealed to Muhammad over 23 years and memorized by his companions. It was not compiled into a single book during his lifetime, but was instead preserved orally and in fragments written on various materials, such as parchment, bones, and palm leaves. This method of preservation raises obvious concerns about accuracy and consistency. After Muhammad's death, the need to compile the Quran became urgent, particularly as many of those who had memorized it were killed in battle. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, is said to have commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit, Muhammad's scribe, to collect the verses into a single manuscript. This compilation, however, was not the final version. Under the third caliph, Uthman, a standardized version of the Quran was produced, and all other variants were ordered to be destroyed. This process of standardization contradicts the claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. Early manuscripts of the Quran reveal variations in wording, spelling, and arrangement. For example, the Birmingham Quran manuscript, one of the oldest surviving fragments, shows slight differences compared to today's Quran. While these differences may seem minor, they challenge the idea of a text that has remained unchanged since its revelation. The destruction of alternative versions also raises important questions. If the Quran is the unaltered word of Allah, why were these variants considered problematic? Why was there a need to suppress them? Some scholars suggest that the Uthmanic recension was not merely a matter of preservation, but also an effort to unify the Muslim community under a single interpretation, reducing the risk of sectarian conflict. This process of editing and standardizing the Quran undermines its claim to divine perfection. A truly perfect and immutable text would not require human intervention to preserve its integrity. Moreover, the reliance on oral tradition, a method prone to error and variation, further complicates the assertion that the Quran is the literal word of Allah. The Quran repeatedly describes Allah as omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly just. These attributes form the foundation of Islamic theology and are central to the Quran's portrayal of Allah as the ultimate deity. However, when these claims are examined philosophically, contradictions and inconsistencies emerge that challenge the coherence of the concept of Allah as presented in the Quran. The first challenge lies in reconciling Allah's omnipotence with His justice. If Allah is all-powerful, then He has the ability to create a world without suffering, evil, or injustice. Yet the Quran acknowledges the existence of these realities, often framing them as tests or punishments. For instance, Surah 67 verse 2 states, "He who created death and life to test you as to which of you is best indeed." This explanation raises the question, why would an omnipotent deity need to test His creations? If Allah is also omniscient, then He already knows the outcome of every test. The idea of divine testing, therefore, appears redundant and inconsistent with the notion of an all-knowing God. This leads to the second challenge, the problem of free will. The Quran asserts that humans have free will to choose between good and evil, and their choices determine their ultimate fate in the afterlife. However, it also emphasizes that Allah has predetermined everything. Surah 57 verse 22 declares, "No disaster strikes upon the earth or among yourselves, except that it is in a register before we bring it into being." If all events and outcomes are predestined, how can humans be truly free? And if they are not free, how can Allah's justice be considered fair? The Quran attempts to resolve this paradox by asserting that Allah's knowledge of future events does not negate human free will. Yet, this explanation fails to address the deeper philosophical issue. If Allah created humans knowing in advance who would succeed and who would fail, then their ultimate fate was effectively decided at the moment of creation. This raises ethical questions about Allah's responsibility for the suffering and damnation of those He knew would falter. Another significant issue arises from Allah's mercy and justice, which the Quran frequently emphasizes. Surah 7, verse 156 describes Allah as the most merciful of the merciful. Yet the Quran also describes severe and eternal punishments for those who disbelieve. Surah 4, verse 56 states, "Indeed, those who disbelieve in our verses, we will drive them into a fire. Every time their skins are roasted through, we will replace them with other skins so they may taste the punishment." This depiction of divine retribution raises questions about the compatibility of mercy and eternal punishment. The Quran's defenders often argue that Allah's justice necessitates punishment for wrongdoing, while His mercy is extended to those who seek forgiveness. However, this framework assumes that disbelief is a moral failing, deserving of eternal punishment. From a philosophical standpoint, this is difficult to justify. Disbelief in many cases is not a deliberate rejection of truth, but a result of upbringing, cultural influences, or lack of evidence. To punish individuals eternally for factors beyond their control seems incompatible with the concept of perfect justice. Further complicating matters is the Quran's emphasis on submission, or Islam, as the primary criterion for salvation. This raises the question, why would an omnipotent and just deity value submission above all else? If Allah's goal is to guide humanity to truth and goodness, why rely on a system that rewards obedience over genuine understanding or moral behavior? This focus on submission aligns more closely with human systems of authority than with the actions of a perfectly just and merciful God. Finally, the Quran's portrayal of Allah as both compassionate and vengeful creates a theological tension. Surah 3 verse 54 describes Allah as the best of deceivers, a statement that has sparked debate among scholars and critics. If Allah is willing to deceive, how can humans trust his promises of justice and mercy? This attribute seems at odds with the Quran's broader claims about Allah's moral perfection. These philosophical challenges are not merely abstract debates, they have real implications for how we understand the Quran's message and the nature of belief. If Allah's attributes are inconsistent or contradictory, it undermines the Quran's claim to be a coherent and divinely revealed guide. The Quran presents itself as a text not only of spiritual guidance but also of historical authority, recounting events from humanity's earliest days to its present and future. However, when its historical claims are subjected to scrutiny, discrepancies and a lack of supporting evidence often emerge, raising questions about its reliability as a historical document. One of the Quran's central historical narratives is the story of the Israelites. It recounts their bondage in Egypt, their exodus under Moses, and their eventual settlement in the Promised Land. Surah 2 verse 50 describes the parting of the sea to save the Israelites and the drowning of Pharaoh's army, a tale echoed in the Bible's book of Exodus. Yet, outside of religious texts, there is no archaeological evidence to support the idea that a large population of Israelites lived in Egypt, let alone that they escaped in such a dramatic fashion. Egyptian records from the relevant time periods, which are otherwise extensive and detailed, make no mention of Israelite slaves or a mass exodus. This silence is particularly striking given the significant logistical and societal impact such an event would have had on ancient Egypt. Additionally, the Quran's references to Pharaoh as a singular figure do not align with the historical reality that Egypt was ruled by a succession of distinct pharaohs, each with their own name and identity. Similarly, the Quran's depiction of Mecca as a thriving center of trade and religion during Muhammad's time has been called into question by historians. Surah 106 verses 1-4 praises the Quraysh tribe for their trade journeys, suggesting that Mecca was a vital hub of commerce. Yet, archaeological evidence for Mecca as a major trading city prior to Islam is virtually non-existent. Historians argue that the trade routes mentioned in Islamic tradition do not align with what is known about ancient Arabian trade networks, which were more heavily centered around cities like Petra and Palmyra. The Quran also references figures and events from earlier Abrahamic traditions, such as Noah's flood, which it describes as a global catastrophe. However, geological and archaeological evidence does not support the idea of a worldwide flood. Localized floods in Mesopotamia may have inspired these stories, but the Quran, like the Bible, presents them as universal events, raising questions about their historical accuracy. Another significant claim is the Quran's account of Dhul-Qarnayn, a figure often identified with Alexander the Great or Cyrus the Great. Surah 18 verses 83-98 describes him as a just and powerful ruler who built a great barrier to protect people from the tribes of Gog and Magog. While this story has clear parallels with earlier traditions, such as the Alexander romance, it lacks historical corroboration. There is no evidence that Alexander or Cyrus constructed such a barrier, and the Quran's geographical descriptions are vague and inconsistent. The Quran's historical inconsistencies extend to its portrayal of pre-Islamic Arabia. It frequently criticizes the polytheistic practices of the Meccan tribes, portraying them as idolaters who worshipped a pantheon of gods alongside Allah. Yet, historical evidence suggests that Arabian polytheism was deeply entrenched and diverse, with no clear indication that Allah held a uniquely exalted position prior to Muhammad's revelations. The Quran's depiction of pre-Islamic Arabia appears to oversimplify and generalize a complex cultural and religious landscape, perhaps to emphasize the stark contrast between Islam and the traditions it sought to replace. One of the most striking historical challenges to the Quran lies in its claim of being the unaltered, eternal Word of God. Islamic tradition holds that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad exactly as it exists today, yet early manuscripts and textual variants tell a different story. For example, the Sana'a manuscript, one of the oldest Quranic texts discovered, contains variations in wording and order compared to the modern Quran. While these differences may not drastically alter the text's meaning, They undermine the claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved since its revelation. The Quran also makes prophetic claims about future events, some of which have been interpreted as having come true. For instance, Surah 30 verses 2 to 4 predicts the defeat and subsequent victory of the Romans over the Persians. While this event did occur, critics argue that such predictions were not extraordinary given the political dynamics of the time. The Roman-Persian conflict was well known, and its outcomes were within the realm of educated speculation. Taken together, these historical issues highlight a recurring theme. The Quran reflects the knowledge, beliefs, and context of 7th century Arabia rather than transcending it. While it provides valuable insights into the worldview of its time, its claims often lack the empirical support needed to establish them as historical facts. The Quran is often hailed by Muslims as a progressive text for its time, particularly in its treatment of women and social justice. It introduced reforms in 7th century Arabia, granting women certain rights and protections that were not universally recognized in pre-Islamic tribal culture. However, when examined critically, the Quran's teachings on gender, morality, and social structures often reflect the patriarchal norms of its time rather than timeless universal principles. The Quran grants women rights in areas such as inheritance, divorce, and property ownership, which were revolutionary in 7th century Arabia. For example, Surah 4 verse 7 states, "For men is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, and for women is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, be it little or much, a legal share." However, this same chapter also stipulates that a woman's share of inheritance is half that of a man's, as seen in Surah 4 verse 11. While this may have been an improvement over pre-Islamic customs, it enshrines inequality rather than addressing it. The Quran also emphasizes the authority of men over women. Surah 4 verse 34 declares, "Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient." The verse continues to allow men to discipline their wives, including striking them if they are disobedient. Apologists often argue that this should be understood in the context of its time or interpreted metaphorically. But the verse's literal meaning has been used to justify domestic violence in many societies. The Quran's treatment of marriage and polygamy also reflects its patriarchal context. Men are permitted to marry up to 4 wives, as stated in Surah 4 verse 3, provided they treat them fairly. However, the requirement of fairness is paradoxical, as even the Quran acknowledges that true equality in treatment is impossible, as seen in Surah 4 verse 129. Women, on the other hand, are prohibited from having multiple husbands, a restriction rooted in patriarchal concerns over lineage and inheritance. One of the most contentious issues is the Quran's stance on slavery and concubinage. While the Quran encourages the freeing of slaves as a virtuous act, as seen in Surah 90 verse 13, it does not explicitly condemn slavery or advocate for its abolition. Instead, it regulates the practice, including the permissibility of sexual relations with female slaves, as mentioned in Surah 4 verse 24. This reflects the norms of 7th century Arabia, where slavery was a deeply ingrained institution. However, the failure to denounce it outright undermines the Quran's claim to be a timeless moral guide. The Quran's moral teachings also extend to concepts of justice and punishment, many of which are severe by modern standards. For instance, theft is punishable by the amputation of hands, as stated in Surah 5, verse 38, and adultery is punishable by flogging, as seen in Surah 24, verse 2. While these punishments were not unusual for their time, they raise ethical questions when viewed through the lens of contemporary human rights. Should divine morality evolve with human understanding, or should it be consistent and unchanging? The Quran's insistence on harsh penalties suggests the former, which is inconsistent with its claim of being a perfect and eternal guide. Additionally, the Quran's portrayal of non-Muslims reflects the socio-political realities of its time, often dividing humanity into believers and disbelievers. Surah 9 verse 5, commonly referred to as the sword verse, commands, "Kill the polytheists wherever you find them," While this verse is contextualized as referring to a specific historical conflict, its broader implications have fueled sectarianism and violence throughout history. Apologists often emphasize the Quran's verses about tolerance and coexistence, such as Surah 2, verse 256. There is no compulsion in religion. However, the coexistence of these conflicting messages creates ambiguity and allows for selective interpretation, often influenced by political or cultural agendas. The Quran's social framework, including its treatment of women, morality, and justice, reflects the norms and challenges of 7th century Arabia. While it introduced reforms that were progressive for its time, these teachings fall short of the universal, transcendent morality one might expect from a divine revelation. Instead, they align closely with the socio-political realities of the era in which the Quran was composed. The Quran's central claim is that it is the literal word of Allah, revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. This assertion forms the foundation of Islamic theology, with billions of Muslims believing it to be a timeless, perfect, and unaltered guide for humanity. However, when we critically examine the Quran's content, structure, and historical context, significant doubts arise about whether it truly originates from a divine source. One of the Quran's most striking characteristics is its fragmented structure. Unlike other religious texts, the Quran is not organized chronologically or thematically. Its verses, or ayat, often jump between topics without clear transitions, creating a disjointed narrative. For example, Surah 2, the longest chapter, covers everything from dietary laws to stories of past prophets to legal guidelines. While believers may view this as a reflection of divine complexity, skeptics argue that it suggests a text compiled piecemeal over time, reflecting the needs and circumstances of its audience rather than a coherent divine plan. The Quran's historical context further complicates its claim to divine origin. If you enjoy our content, we'd love your support. By joining one of our channel memberships, you help us continue creating videos like this one while gaining access to some amazing perks. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive content available only to supporters, earn loyalty badges to show off in comments and live chats, and enjoy priority responses to your comments, shoutouts, and more. The best part? Memberships start at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee. Even small contributions make a big difference for the PJ Bible TV team in covering production costs and delivering the content you love. And if you're not ready to become a channel member today but still want to support us, there are other ways to help. Engaging with our videos is a tremendous way to show your support. By taking just a few moments to like the video, share it with friends, family, or on social media, and leave a comment, you're telling the YouTube algorithm to share our content with more people. Your support, no matter how you choose to show it, means the world to us. Thank you for being part of the PJ Bible TV community.